real pleasure to be here this afternoon to be talking more about trees. I know you've had lots of sessions on trees in this tent. This session is going to focus on the whole policy environment, the support for tree planting, and what we need to get even more right to enable us to really fulfill our potential of trees in farms and on crofts. We've got an amazing panel here today to take some questions from the far left. We've got David McKay, we've got Gareth Phillips. David is from the Soil Association. He's got his gilet on, so he's all right. We know who he is. We've got Gareth. You've got yours on too, from Scottish Forestry. We have Phil Knott from the Nature Friendly Farmers Network and Crofter on Skye, and Johnnie Balfour, whose farm's not very far away from here at all, and is very involved with Pasture for Life. So we've got a great panel. I'm going to encourage everybody. There's a small gang in the room here today, so don't feel you have to wait right till the end to ask your questions. Take your hand up and I'll bring you in as soon as we can. And I'm going to encourage our panel to ask each other questions too, to argue amongst themselves, not be too polite, because it's 3 o'clock on a, what day is it? Thursday afternoon. So let's keep the energy moving. As I say, the session today the title is Unlocking Potential, How Can Policy Better Support More Trees on Farms and Crofts. We all know that grants are essential to enable us as farmers to make that big investment in trees. The cash flow implications of not having some support right at the beginning make that pretty tricky. But are we being creative enough with them so that we can really release the potential of trees on our farms as well as through woodland creation and forestry? So I'm going to kick off by asking a couple of you to talk a little bit about what's currently available. I think it'd be good to come to you, Gareth, for that. And then I'm going to ask our practitioners here perhaps to think about where are the gaps. I'm going to sit down now, but Gareth, what have we got that's available to us now?
Thanks, Helen. So in terms of grant offering, we've got the Forestry Grant Scheme at the moment, which supports agroforestry, although agroforestry, I'm sure we all know, is a very broad term, and what we look at in terms of agroforestry under forestry grants is probably a fairly narrow band of that. So it's only silver arable or silver pastoral planting, and that's with a sort of density of 150 at the low end to 400 trees per hectare at the high end. So some of the feedback we've already had on that is we want lower and we want higher. So this is the issue with it. So that sort of covers that area. We've also got a larger range of grants available. So if you wanted to plant a shelter belt, for example, you could do that with native broadleaves that we offer grants for. And there's also diverse or commercial sort of conifer, cypress spruce, that kind of thing as well. So it depends on really what you're looking at. We don't do hedgerows. That's one of the things we don't do. So I guess the two main ones would probably be, in terms of agroforestry, depending on how broad your definition is the sort of shelter belt aspect and the silver arable, silver pastoral planting at the moment. So, and the rates for those, we've got two payment rates, a higher rate of just over 5,400 per hectare for 300 to 400 stems per hectare, and then the lower rate, which is just over 2,700 per hectare, and that's for 150 to 200 trees, so depending on what your objectives are. And we recently updated that, so it was announced at Royal Highland Show last year that we updated the agroforestry grant to include two new aims. Previously it was only for timber producing species, so you'd be looking at broadleaves that would be pruned and tried to be made into sort of veneer grade timber. We now support planting simply for biodiversity, so with no other objective in mind other than just getting some trees in to help with more invertebrates and things, and shelter, shade, and fruit and nut. So we now support fruit trees and nut trees. And I was saying I met Johnnie last year at Meg Inch, and this was sort of it was sort of just after we were in the process of launching the new agroforestry, getting it sort of developed. And I remember having a conversation with a colleague who would sign off on all this, and I'd said about having walnut within the nut, one of the species we produce and support, and he said you can't grow walnuts in Scotland. And we went to Meg Inch, and of course in the orchard they had these beautiful walnut trees. So took photos of those and sent them immediately to my boss and was like, "Ha ha! Actually, we can." So that was all launched. So those are the additional aims that we now offer, and a more flexibility in design. It used to be very rigid in terms of how it was designed, but now we kind of welcome people coming to us and sort of saying, well, as long as they can demonstrate that it's appropriate for the tree, or the tree is appropriate, and it's going to work with the farming system, then we're trying to be a lot more open-minded and flexible about that.
And that's a one-off planting grant, and then there's no ongoing payment after
So
that.
5 years of payment.
Years.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's I think 120 something pound for the higher payment rate for 5 years following, each year for 5 years, and then slightly lower for the lower density for 5 years as well, and then typically 20. I think is it 20 or now I'm going to get muddled up. I think it's 20 years, it might be 10 years contract for the agroforestry. So that's how long that you're in a contract period you have to maintain it for.
Yeah.
So and then after that, it's obviously down to you and however you want to manage that going forward.
Fantastic, thank you.
You're welcome.
Johnny, Phil, where are the gaps in this? Where are the limitations, or what would you like to see? Is it working for you?
The short answer for me is no. We have just planted 1,000 fruit trees. We're having a farm walk in a couple of weeks. If you're signed up, you can come. And we're doing it in an arable field, but we've put a grass lay in to build the fertility in the field for get the fertility out of the cattle. We've done all of that planting out of our own bank account because the number of stems per hectare that we wanted to plant was way below the 150 that is the lower limit that we're allowed to do. And the funding doesn't really go very far, especially 120 quid a year per hectare. I mean, that's not paying for very much activity to go and deal with it.
Yeah.
So I've taken a bit of a punt, really, and planted these trees for biodiversity reasons. And I want, when we eventually go back into arable, to have my alleys of arable with 4-metre strips in between them of a beetle bank with all sorts of invertebrates. And the trees are a way of us getting some income from that 4-metre strip by using the 3D space above it.
So when you're doing that thinking, do you think you can justify that commercially yourself from the benefits that you envisage happening over time? How much are you doing it out of the goodness of your heart, and how much are you doing it for commercial reasons?
From my perspective, I think it will give a commercial benefit in terms of my bank account. However, I've taken a punt at the moment, and all of the money that I've spent, I haven't got any of it back.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see when the fruit matures whether I can make it pay then.
Yeah, but it's that cash flow implication.
I'm not. The cost of putting it in, I've chalked up to what is the cost of putting in a 4-metre hedgerow.
Yeah.
To give me the extra biodiversity that I want in order to manage my crops better.
Yeah, great. Phil, how about you?
I have a 3-hectare croft, so it's a small parcel of land, and that's the in-by kind of the best ground essentially, and then there's hill ground that goes with that. And my croft is the benefit of a former what was woodland grant scheme at the time, so now forestry grant scheme. So the whole croft was fenced 19 years ago. Before that, what the long-term plan was at that point, I don't necessarily know. We moved in 10 years ago and immediately had the benefit of the shelter within that. If we'd taken on a bareland crop, we would have done it in a planned agroforestry system, but it was great to have 10-year head start. It's a long time for establishing trees on the west coast of Scotland. Limitations of more difficult soil, exposure to the salt winds and things are a bit slower. So with that that context, I benefited massively from that scheme there, but that was not necessarily a plan. I've restructured what I've got within that. One of the main objections you'll get from Crofts is trees will just take the land completely out. And if it's a larger forestry grant scheme, essentially you have to give over all of your ground for trees with long-term conditions on that. In terms of can you graze underneath that? Probably not for 10, but I don't know what the latest restrictions are. And so there's relative hostility, I suppose, to that because you're taking what small ground you've got and taking it out of production. Now I've shown you can restructure that and use coppice and pollard. I have a huge weight of products layer within that. Excellent horticulture. I've got a tree nursery within my partner does basketry. Where we benefit from the shelter, the microclimate. Try to have a circular economy of a closed loop economy of creating our own compost and other products, completely self-sufficient in wood fuel. So we benefited massively from that. I can demonstrate that to other crofters, but that's with the caveat it's 19 years to get to that stage, those trees to be managed there. So that is a big challenge for folk when they're looking at their land, how they can manage their small parcels, how to do that. So time frames are important. So if you are going to put something in, you definitely need to factor in income foregone if you are going to put trees in there. But it needs to be integrated. It needs to be with the land management that you've got in place and sympathetic to that. So it's continuing grazing or allowing animals in at an earlier stage potentially. Because locally, culturally, there isn't much of a history of trees in that farm landscape. It's been quite a few hundred years without that. We can show that those cultural practices can benefit, of course, from the shelter and the shade and all the extra products you can get. But it is quite a challenge for folk to consider. So that's a larger scheme. Agroforestry, again, it could work, but extremely challenging conditions. Costs of establishing things on the west coast are rather difficult. Deer fencing, for example, my area is high red deer south of Skye. Deer fencing, I think, is now about £23-24 a metre established in. That's a huge cost for external fence. My deer fence, for example, ran for 74 metres, and I'm just keeping it propped up. If you start multiplying that nearly 1,000 metres times that, it's a huge amount of money just for that alone. So if you then think about cactus guards or anything within that, you would have to meet kind of costs for that and demonstrate it. And I'd say one of the biggest limiters as well is there's no demonstration sites really for that. I'm proudly show off my croft, but it's not a planned agroforestry system. There are no models anywhere that a crofter can come along and basically kick the tires of a cactus garden and get a real feel of it and see what it's like and see, yeah, this could work for my system and see things at 1 year, 5 years and 10 years ideally. So I've restructured a woodland grant scheme to get to where I am, but there's very few other models for folk to see, so the uptake is understandably quite slow.
Thank you. And I know there are probably loads of other people in the room here who've got experience of some of those barriers, so I'd love to come to you in a moment to kind of, if there's any of you who want to share the limitations you're finding or the opportunities you've discovered, do share them early on. But David, just going to come to you first. We've just produced a report with the Woodland Trust, trying to explore what this maybe ought to look like, how we could create some more flexibility there. Do you want to talk a little bit about that report and how it could really help solve some of the challenges we've just heard about?
Yeah, hopefully. So we've been working for a few years now with Woodland Trust in Scotland, trying to influence policymakers within government about the benefits and the opportunity as we see it for integrating more trees on farms and crofts, and we were both involved with Scottish Forestry kind of inputting into the redesign of the agroforestry options that Gareth mentioned. But as Gareth pointed out, the density, the planting density of those options are between 150 and 400. So we also identified a gap there for lower density planting options, and we had a workshop where we brought together farmers and crofters to listen to some of the points that were just made there by Johnnie and Phil. Both from farmers who had tried it, who are doing it already, but also from those who, for various reasons, felt they were opposed to trees, and then tried to develop a picture of the type of options that would be practical and that farmers wanted to see within the grant system. So we went away with some consultants and built up 6 options. I won't go through all 6 of them, but as an example, one was a silvopastoral option between 10 and 30 trees per hectare. So, in effect, trying to think about developing a wood pasture system. There was others, tree enclosures, so fenced off areas with trees and shrubs around them. We looked at biodiverse hedgerows, so wider hedgerows with different species. And we produced costings for all of those and maintenance regimes, and we put it all together in a report. We launched it last month at the Highland Show. We had the Cabinet Secretary Marie Goujon, who was here yesterday, speaking at that launch, the Junior Minister for Agriculture Jim Fairley, and civil servants from the Agriculture Division, from Scottish Forestry and from Nature Scot. And what we're trying to do is open up that conversation with government and say, we're in a place at the moment where government is designing a replacement for the Common Agricultural Policy. We think there is an opportunity to fit some of these options within. They've got a 4-tier system they're operating to, so tier 2 and 3, we feel like somewhere in there, some of these options could be provided. And that could be coming from the agriculture budget rather than the forestry budget, because in our view, this is about enhancing food production systems. There are benefits, we've already heard from planting trees with shade and shelter for livestock, regulating growing conditions, reducing soil erosion. We could go on and on about the benefits, but ultimately this is about, in my view, making our farming systems more resilient for the future. So we think that should be funded through agriculture, and it's making it the grant options as accessible as possible for farmers within the constraints. And I know that Gareth and his colleagues will be working within specific constraints in the system, but just to try and make that, as I say, as accessible to all, because the opportunity is really significant to integrate a lot more trees on farms, to help with government planting targets, to build more resilience in our systems. But we're not getting that uptake at the moment, so it's about how we make those schemes more open and accessible.
That's really helpful. It feels like there has been quite a shift in terms of flexibility from the forestry world over the last 20 years or whatever. It used to be, incredibly restrictive. It feels like we're moving in the right direction, but there's many more things we could be doing to open that up still further. Has anybody else in the room got experiences of when they've been trying to do this stuff themselves, and where the barriers that they've come up against? Anybody want to share anything around the kind of challenges you're facing and putting some of this stuff together? Yeah, hi.
Not necessarily a problem, but a potential problem, let's say. So if we were fortunate enough to apply and receive a grant from the Forestry Grant Scheme, and a crop was to fail within the first 10 years, maybe that's a fear factor for us, the financial implication of that. So maybe you could just explain to us what the legal obligations are and the landowner if the crop fails.
Do you mean if the timber crop? Or,
yes.
Yeah.
Plant trees and the down.
So part of the reason you're given a maintenance payment is because it's accepted, I think, generally in forestry, that when you plant a woodland, not every tree is going to survive straight off the bat. So you have a process of what's called beating up, which is you go in every year for the first 3 years and you replace any any trees that have died, so that hopefully by the end of what we call the establishment period, usually about 5 years, everything is reasonably healthy. If it fails completely, I guess to rewind a bit, I would hope that would never happen, because there should be no application getting through to the point of approval if the ground conditions are so unsuited to trees that they would die, straight after planting. So that shouldn't happen, full stop. If it did, then the obligation would be for you to either maintain it yourself after your maintenance payment's gone, or finished, or you'd have to repay the grant, and then obviously the land would be out of contract, and you'd sort of do it that way. So those are really the main ways. But yeah, as I said, I think the likelihood, I can understand the fear of that, but I think the likelihood is quite low. We wouldn't be approving applications that were sort of really so marginal that could happen. But insurance is another one. there's always, obviously, we've seen an increasing amount of wildfires in Scotland over the past few years with things warming up, and I think we would generally recommend to anybody who's looking at doing forestry to ensure that young woodland, or if it's a commercial woodland, potentially throughout its life, to things like extreme weather events, wind blow, fire, these kind of things, because it's within your best interest to do that as an asset, I suppose. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yes, but I would probably say that this problem of trees not surviving might be becoming a bigger problem with climate change. And there've been 2 or 3 very well publicised cases of large planting of trees in Scotland, which we all know about, that have failed, and that will have been with professional advice, and that was with forestry grant scheme approval, and that cost them a lot of money. So it's just probably going into it with one eyes open and with a large budget to be able to deal with the unexpected.
Absolutely, and I'm sure I know which ones you're referencing, the large schemes, but and I would say again, some of these are still within that first sort of establishment phase, and there is an opportunity that, to try again and look at what's happened, get new trees in the ground, try and get that properly established, and if that doesn't happen, then there will be repercussions, of course. But sorry.
No. It's a really good point, and I think that it's one of the. I was slightly surprised that in the Soil Association Woodland Trust report that we didn't emphasise more the maintenance payments or the need for some ongoing kind of support for it, because it's quite expensive actually looking after trees. I know we've got Ben in the audience here who keeps talking about less but better as far as tree planting goes. Let's actually maybe sometimes slow down our planting, but really invest in getting them properly mulched and that kind of thing to really be able to cope with these very difficult droughty conditions. Certainly we're getting down south. Some of you came down for the agroforestry show last year, and it was like 35 degrees.
It's never dry here.
It's never dry here. But is your planting window also narrowing here a bit in terms of earlier springs? Is that becoming a bit more of a challenge?
Well, it depends on the type of tree, but I wouldn't have said so. I think it's still okay. I think some people, you always get people who push it a little bit, but no, I don't think so. I mean, but drought is becoming an issue. Even sort of particularly in the northeast of Scotland, Aberdeenshire, those kind of areas. So the suitability of trees is definitely a question that's ongoing. And I've taken some of my my team out to forest research a few weeks ago just to network with them and see what they're up to. And they're actually doing experiments at the moment on drought resistance in certain species to really look ahead at what how trees react to that and what tree species might be the best to cope with these kind of conditions. But yeah. Lots of talk ongoing in that area, provenance as well, and part of your grant we would say you have to plant trees from the local area, but there's obviously talk ongoing about, well, do you actually want to take seed from an area 2 zones south of you and start planting that, because in 50 years is that going to be more climatically similar? So yeah.
And just to pick up on the point about maintenance and current policy, we're obviously in a place where the policy development process is still ongoing, but from what we have seen so far, the intention from Scottish Government for those Tier 2 payments, what they call the enhanced payment, the initial proposals there were that farmers and crofters would receive payments if they had agroforestry systems in place. There was no allowance within that for a capital grant to actually get the trees in the ground in the first place, and as we know, very few farmers are actually doing this. So part of our thinking was we deal with the capital cost, the upfront cost through the grant, and once those trees are in the ground, that those farmers are then rewarded by the future payment system from 26 onwards for having those.
So they're still eligible, they don't have to take it out,
yeah.
Which is always a big thing for us when we planted ours. We had to take it out of the system.
That's right.
And Johnny.
Well, I don't know how much land you took out, but given that I've taken all of my land out, to anyone in the Scottish Government here, but the amount of land that I took out, because the cattle can graze right up to the edge of the cactus guard, and the cactus guard is about that big, I multiplied that space by 1,000 and I came to 0.00 whatever it was of a hectare, so I just excluded 0.01 and I'm done. So I'm not sure it makes a, in terms of exclusion, as long as you're not putting a fence around the whole thing, the amount of land that you have to exclude if each individual tree is protected is very minimal.
Yeah, and I guess you trade that off against the cost of a cactus grant, against the cost of a permanent
So you're
fence.
comparing the
Yeah.
cost. But
Yeah.
if I was to exclude the whole area, like a woodland,
Yeah.
not only is that's excluded permanently for life. My grandparents planted a bunch of forestry in the 50s, and it's still excluded now. And even if I'm putting cattle in there and managing them and growing the grass underneath, that still doesn't count for any sort of biodiversity advantage under the scheme.
As a, I guess, a point of clarification on that as well, I'd spent quite a lot of time having to pore through EU regulations and sort of arguing with or discussing with ARPID about this sort of exclusions and things, and actually managed to change their mind on this, because previously it was basically that you'd have to deduct all the area of each tree and guard in an agroforestry system, but actually the way that the legislation is set up is such that that isn't the case now. But the only thing is it used to be that you would only be allowed to maintain your payment if you did it through the forestry grant scheme. That was the way the legislation was set up. That's not the case now. However, it has to be the same specification as the forestry grant scheme. So you don't have to have had public funding. You can do it yourself but it has to be the same specification, which I appreciate is restrictive, as you've mentioned before. It didn't work for you, so
No.
it wouldn't have changed your situation. But if somebody did want to go out and plant 150 trees with cactus guards, as long as it met the specifications of the forestry grant scheme, they wouldn't have to deduct the area. So
That's interesting. In terms of, you mentioned that you're having discussions with ARPID, do you find, is the relationship between departments, so historically agriculture and forestry were fairly siloed, I think it's fair to say. Are you finding now there's much more integration in terms of the policy development?
absolutely, yeah, and what a time for Lynn to walk in.
Eating an apple.
Yeah, sorry, Lynn. No, and I said yesterday that so Lynn runs sort of co-host or organizer of the Integrating Tree Network, and that's been something that has been great at actually bringing us together, I would say, because Lynn's Scottish Forestry and the co-organizer is Hilary, who's Scottish Government, so in agricultural policy. So it's definitely bringing us together. We've been having lots of conversation and meetings about particularly the areas that forestry grant scheme doesn't cover, that would sort of should have been covered by EECS,
Yeah.
but haven't been. But I think there's discussions ongoing internally about that, and some work going on to develop that, and so, as you've mentioned, in light of the agriculture reform programme. So yeah, definitely a lot more sort of cross-pollination of ideas, and I've had people approaching me for like the small farm grant scheme and the crofting agricultural grant scheme, asking if I could help them with specifications and things. So definitely
That's
a lot
really
more
good to hear.
internal talk going on. So very positive, and making sure that those areas that are missed, we can hopefully plug those gaps so that the forestry grant scheme can do that X, and EECS can do Y, but we're covering the whole lot. So
Sounds really encouraging that those silos are kind of breaking down, and there's just a lot more opportunity to give that continuum of opportunity, from huge scale to
yeah,
single
absolutely.
trees. Phil, anything you want to add in on this in terms of barriers? And
I still think hearts and minds are still a vital thing for where we are in the country. Obviously, I say the right tree in the right place for the right reason. Obviously, the adage of that. And in many parts of crofting counties, there are ground nesting birds, open landscapes that are traditional and kind of high nature value. You're going to be able to respect that. But an awful lot of crofters will still be kind of fearful of putting trees in, and culturally it's not necessarily seen as the done thing. And in crofting meetings in my few years, there have been people shouting about trees, that you cannot eat trees, and that kind of argument on that, because I suppose it's seen in many ways forestry potentially as an imposition, an external imposition onto the land, whereas it's not something coming from that. So it needs to be a bit of a groundswell from the area. It does, that's why I kind of highlight demonstration events and kind of making it a bit more user friendly and getting the local ground agents and stuff on board and upskilled within that, because generally most of the crofters are not very good at doing the larger payment options on so EECs or whatever that may come through, or crofting agricultural grant schemes. They often go through SAC consulting, so you've seen, so those are kind of the reps that will often help get those things through the scope of the office. I think there's a lot to be done there. So I think events, intricate trees work has been absolutely fantastic for that. We just need more of that, I suppose. And yeah, I need more demonstration sites within that, even little pockets, little trial areas, just so folk can just see that and talk about the benefit to the bottom line of the business, as well as obviously the biodiversity and everything else that comes with that. But just, yeah, a long way to go. So.
Could I pick up on something you're talking about the hearts and minds of thinking that trees are in position and that you can't eat trees? I would agree, but actually the trees that I planted you can, because I'm going to get apples off them, and pears and plums and damsons and all sorts of other stuff. And some other trees we can't eat, but cows can, and goats and deer and all sorts. So I think all of us in agriculture especially, need to be, I think we should be more aware of the fact that it is not only our duty to use the land for food, but also fibre and fuel. And it's okay on any patch of land for the balance between those three to be one way or the other. And I'm pretty sure that on a low ground on the Let farm down there, it would be great if it was mostly food. If it's, I think in agriculture we need to be honest about the fact that if we're growing feed wheat, we're not producing much food. But if we're producing potatoes and oats and whatever that we're actually eating, it is actually food. I would love to see us being getting away from the silos and thinking in agriculture of the trees as another crop. This is a crop that we are using to produce, it might be food, it might be fibre, it might be fuel. And all three of those things are okay from that.
I was just going to say, just in terms of the food debate, because that is one that sort of crops up a lot. And for anyone who was following the agriculture bill through Parliament, I'm sure you were all very excited to watch it, as I was. But there was an amendment at stage 3 that was brought forward by Moda Grant, and that was accepted in Parliament. And that was basically that in any sort of future iteration of forestry grant support, through regulation, we'll be looking to sort of, in regulation, exclude certain types of land. So what her intention was arable land, basically. So arable land, prime arable land for food production. So I say that amendment went through. So that's, like I said, that's very much the policy direction of trying to, agroforestry, not quite the same. We'll be working with the agricultural community to define this in regulation to make sure it works. But that went through. So yeah.
Personally, I would say that piece of legislation stinks, because on prime agricultural land, currently, we're not using it to grow food. And the fact that somebody's got something in saying that we need it to grow food and then we're going to grow malted barley, why shouldn't we be growing some, willow to coppice, or why couldn't we be growing a pine tree in order to make some floorboards?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be the importance of making sure that we're consulting with the agricultural community to get this right. So if it's set out in legislation, that this isn't something that's going to be a hindrance more than a help. So,
it's that idea of a land use framework, actually, which is really helpful thinking in terms of what you do where and how much of it and how do you get that multifunctionality working really well. I remember somebody, when I was in my early days of exploring with trees, saying, everybody talks about putting trees on the really poor ground. I mean, trees got a lot better on really good ground. We've got this kind of mindset that a little bit that trees just should go where nothing else will grow, rather than actually thinking of them properly as a crop.
And a tool as well. The older trees, one of the biggest issues you'll see on crofts these days is rushes, soft rush kind of infestation on a lot of the grass. And obviously, land management practices have got it to that stage. People often look for remedies for that. you can see the sphere of influence around the older trees on the croft. And I haven't done management underneath those. You just watch the rushes disappear with that time. You could continue to graze that, of course, throughout that. But the nitrogen improvement, the breaking up of the compaction underneath it, and the leaf litter that's kind of piling down every year, it was a free nature-based solution to use that, and it wouldn't have taken out what that much land essentially when it was that. So that's a simple solution for so many of our problems. Certainly not liming and French drains.
Yeah, I was just going to reflect on that point about planting on prime agricultural land, because it reminds me of so much of this debate when we talk about hearts and minds is about communication and use of language. And I think a good example of where, from a government policy standpoint, that communication fell down was what's happened recently in Wales, where this narrative developed that farmers are going to have to give up 10% of their land for trees and 10% of their land for nature. We're going to lose all this productive farmland. And actually, if you looked at the detail of the policy, that was not quite as advertised, and there was an opportunity to graze livestock, for example, through trees. And there was much more to it in terms of the grazing requirements for habitats as well. But once that narrative takes hold, the opposition builds up, and then it becomes a very difficult situation for politicians, for policymakers to navigate. And I know in Scotland there's a great awareness amongst the politicians that we don't want that happening here. We don't want farmers outside Holyrood complaining. So, and what that then leads to is a little bit of timidity and caution about policy, when in actual fact we're at a point in time with the climate and nature challenge we face where we really need bold policy making. And I think that at some point some of these challenges will have to be faced up to, but it's so important how that's communicated and the type of language that we use.
Yeah, Johnny, I know you want to come back. Can everybody hear okay? I just want to make sure everything's good. Johnny?
I was going to add to that the idea that we don't want trees on prime arable land or prime food growing land, I find rather ridiculous. If you stand on the top of the hill on a windy day in the spring and you look down the Eden Valley down there, which anyone from around here will agree is prime agriculture, lots of veg growing going down towards Cooper. On a windy day, it looks like 1930s Oklahoma. You can see the soil billowing around the air. More trees in the right place to catch erosion in a proper agroforestry scheme that has been planned with those crops in mind would go a massive way to alleviating that damage.
Just to clarify as well, the restriction won't apply to agroforestry. It's the way the legislation set up. Agroforestry is sort of a separate line, whereas this applies to sort of the creation of woodland, so it's more targeted at sort of large-scale afforestation.
But even a woodland strip of 25 metres, around. I mean, there are some 100-acre fields down there. I mean, that's splitting them up into 4 and making proper strips and things could be really useful.
Yeah.
So that and again, it's about the communication, about the narrative around it is hugely important. And actually, if we as farmers are quite often just blanket no to trees. So if we ask farmers, do you want trees? The answer is always going to be no. So actually asking people what they want is possibly not the best way to go about it.
So how do you deal with this challenge of the narrative around trees still being quite toxic and, actually we've got to get over this, you're talking about some more bold policy making. I mean, how do we, it's great when you've got farmer practitioners like you two who are actually, selling the benefits. But what more needs to happen? And I'm really interested in other people's views in the room as well, to kind of shift this into a more positive kind of dialogue, because we really do need that to happen quite quickly. I mean, and the flexibility we're talking about here will help enormously. So there's no one size fits all. This doesn't feel like an imposition. So that's going to help. But what more can we all be doing to kind of break down these preconceived ideas about trees. Toby, yeah.
I mean, I think it's really interesting because, as you say, on the one hand, farmers are said to be anti-tree, but on the other hand, consumers are all pro-tree.
Yeah.
And you know, maybe therefore the opportunity is, whether through soil association exchange or something else, to have that information flowing up to the consumer, even if it's a bottle of whiskey or a bottle of gin that says, you know, grown on a farm with trees.
Yeah.
It's like sort of, you know, dolphin-friendly tuna. Somehow, once we know that, there's something where the consumer power will come to, because this separation is what is unsustainable in so many ways.
So there's some products from agroforestry type systems, and and just kind of celebrating what farmers are doing with their trees on their farm and making that more explicit.
Yeah, and not only about sort of trumpet blowing and but actually just about this transparency of information flow that allows information other than money to be flowing up and down the supply chain. I think has real potential.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say on that sort of thing that the supply chain can dictate this, I suppose. And I don't know how much I can say, so I'll keep it sort of reasonably vague. But we've been in talks with a group who are sort of looking at dairy farmers, and basically the sort of large company that buys all their milk is offering them extra money per litre for if they put trees on their dairy farms. So that's dictated from the sort of the supply within the supply chain. So there's that as well. And I guess it goes back to almost like that, the sort of dolphin-friendly tuna or FSC certified timber, that it's coming from a good source that are doing good practices, then people might be more likely to pay a premium for it as well.
I think that's far more likely to drive changes in practice in the short term if it's coming from the supply chain down to the primary producer, rather than the best will in the world. Government policy can be quite slow in some respects. I think in this area it's slightly playing catch up, but I think if those suppliers are saying to the primary producer, actually we want you to plant trees and there's an incentive for you to do so, then it feels like that might be a good driver in the short term.
Does that sound like a regenerative food certification? Which I remember last year at Groundswell, you being on a panel talking about how possibly not a good idea that might be. I love the idea of being able to celebrate good things that are going on in farm, but I think we have to be very real about often who the beneficiaries of that are, and the beneficiaries of those sorts of things are rarely the farmer, and more likely the processor, retailer, people in the middle.
Yeah, so what you're saying is the more farmer-led this is, and the less it feels like somebody's telling you to do something, and more about farmers embracing this opportunity and running with it themselves, the better. Albeit it does help too if you've got some support from your supply chain to do these things, and some support from policymakers to do these things. So that, but it's.
I'm just thinking. Yeah. I'm thinking of certain supply chains that we're in on our arable farm, where we are being told. I have to be careful about what I'm saying too.
Don't be too careful.
If this is being recorded, I can't be on. Where we're being told what we have to do in order to supply into a big multinational, so that they can put a stamp on a word on their packet, and the foundations of that word are built on its foundations of sand, it feels like we're being told as farmers and growers to do something that they're getting the benefit from.
Yeah. So I think what Toby was talking about a bit too was looking at outcomes rather than processes, which 100. I think is probably the direction of travel we all want to go in. Actually, is what are we delivering here, and how do we make that? So instead of arguing about words and and exactly whether this practice is better than that practice, what is the system actually delivering in terms of outcomes, and how do we make that more transparent to the consumer at the end of the day? And maybe that works with trees too. You know, it's not enough just to plant them, you have to see them thrive and manage them well and manage the environment around them well, and that'll give you the outcome we're kind of looking for. Maybe that's where we're going. What else do farmers need to support them in this transition to a more tree-friendly world? You know, you talked a little bit, Phil, about some of the demo farms, the ability to see it in your area, in your context, on a farm that looks like yours. Are there other things in terms of knowledge that we need to be helping with?
I think our big gaps in knowledge in terms of the highlight of just how good trees are for certain, certainly for biodiversity, of course, as well as that, and in the different functions they can perform. And the fact that they are not just a static thing you put there and walk away from. I think the forestry perspective is there for that. But our tradition of land management and woodland management is of working our trees, then remaining alive, of course, coppicing, pollinating. It's a continual crop you can work with livestock at different levels, with excluding livestock, and with integrating all manner of things on rotations that could be part of the farm system. So I think most people across Scotland would probably benefit from that kind of knowledge. I think we've lost a lot of our connection with our woodland management, and we kind of respect our forests, and there's certainly great highlighting of the Caledonian pine forest and the rainforests, but the vast majority of our woodlands have been managed with high densities of people for centuries. We've kind of lost that connection. So I think that's a key point to get back.
I was going to say that there are sometimes grants available, capital grants, for helping farmers with slurry tanks and putting up a shed for this, that, and next thing. Wouldn't it be wonderful if some of that money, in order to achieve the same thing, i.e. manage your animals better, instead you've got to plant a bunch of trees, and the money that you were getting based on how many animals you could protect just went into that area. I mean, you could plant a hell of a lot of trees for the cost of one shed, or improving one slurry tank, or whatever it may be, and that system's change would be immense. And if it was possible, I know that this is a problem within the funding system at the moment, that rather than the government looking at what the value to them of whatever ecosystem service it is, they look at the cost of what it is and then fund 90% of it. Imagine if they valued it and then said, we're going to pay you on the value, and if as a farmer you can do it for less, good luck to you.
Yeah. So again, looking at those outcomes.
That would be much better.
And another point, I mean, Lynn's right in my line of sight, and we've talked a little bit about the Integrating Trees Network, which is doing fantastic work. I know, Phil, you've been involved with that. So definitely more of that knowledge exchange, the peer-to-peer sharing of information. But I think in the longer term as well, we also need to think about the people who are going to agricultural college and the courses that are there. Are those courses talking about the type of integrated land use that we're going to do now? There was an agroforestry course, I think, at Bangor University, if I'm right in saying so. I went to SRUC and wasn't taught about trees, but I think that next generation coming through, it's really important that the curriculum is incorporating this, and that to me is in the longer term would help to develop that mindset shift that we're not quite there with.
Well, just to add to that, and particularly the sort of higher education aspect, so Lynn does a lot of great work working with the School of Forestry, and goes and does guest lectures there and talks, obviously gives a bit of the sort of farming background, but also, I think is it this year? Lynn, you have to keep me right. The SRUC are now doing an optional module on forestry as part of the agriculture.
Shouldn't be optional, should it? Should be right in the core.
but I think as a first step, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah.
We were delighted to see that, and Lynn's been helping with that, and we were potentially looking at how we could come and help do some lectures, guest lectures in SRUC. So yeah, it's on the right track. So yeah.
That's great. Now, any other questions? I'm aware we've only got about 10 minutes left, so any other questions or comments from anybody else here? I mean, one of the areas, come on in.
Can I ask Phil and David a question? Phil, first for you. You've talked about changing hearts and minds in the crofting counties. Could you give a little bit of insight into the recent admission of woodland crofts and whether you think that's going to change the conversation at all? And then David, looking at the report that you recently did, can you let us know a little bit about payment rates and how they compare to what is currently out there?
So woodland crofts as a handle has been adopted in the last 12 years or so, and it's often where you're taking an active piece of woodland or felled forestry or active forestry and they're designated in that area as a croft. It's often clear fell, it's often the most challenging land to work with, but people are desperate for the opportunity to grow somewhere. I'm working with a couple on Skye just now, just up the Orbost estate, and they're looking to get tenants in for an established piece of woodland, which is kind of a mixed kind of policy woodland, I suppose. And they're putting in fruit trees ahead of that going out, and that's a fantastic model, and it's encouraging that kind of direction of travel within that. I think it's very replicable. I think working with FLS, Forestry Land Scotland, and others, and as other opportunities for more of these to be rolled out, it's been quite painfully slow, I would say. Getting new crofts in is quite a challenge, and of course it's not to say, it's a challenge for numbers. I think it's probably maybe 12 crofts or so a year that are created new, so it's a bit slow. I think we'd like to see it across all of Scotland. Historical context there as well.
So yes, in terms of payment rates, I mentioned earlier there were 6 different options, so there's a huge amount of variation because some of those options are small woodlands, some are single trees. But we basically developed a methodology which was looking at the actual planting cost as of this year, the cost of materials, the cost of saplings, the income forgone element, and then we built that up to pitch at a level that we think is palatable to government and to Scottish forestry, or at least enough that they won't run out the door immediately when we sit down with them, but also realistically tries to cover the cost to the farmer. So at the moment, I mean, Gareth will know better than I will, but the intervention rate in terms of the current grant is what is it, 50-60%, something like that?
We put it up last year. Prices seem to be fluctuating so much. I think when we did it, I'm trying to recall now, it's something like 70% towards a cactus guard. At the time it was when we set it, that might have changed now, and then it was something like 90% to a weld mesh guard. But I talked yesterday about we had to sort of balance multiple protection options within one payment rate, which made kind of trying to increase the flexibility quite difficult.
So hopefully where we've pitched it at is right, and I'm sure others might take issue with that, but for us it's very much a starting point. So we've effectively put this on the table in front of government, civil servants, and said, look, this is what we've come up with. Let's have a conversation about it. We're by no means wedded to this, but let's start at a realistic point, or what we think is realistic in terms of incentivising uptake, because at the moment we're not getting the uptake that I think we would hope for, and there's lots of reasons for that, and not just financial, should I, but hopefully it's the beginning of a conversation where we can develop that policy, working with the government, and it may need to be tweaked over time. I think we've seen what has happened in England, and Ben's here, all about this, and over time some of those rates have been tweaked and the things have been improved, and so it's more of an iterative process perhaps, but I think over the coming years hopefully we can get it to a point where it's pitched right for farmers and crofters.
From a croft perspective, the rates in there are accurate and fair. I think that would make a massive step in encouraging folk. If you can just make it so easy, so that's the cost covered, and there's income forgone within that as well. That would make a massive difference.
Just to sort of, I guess, play devil's advocate slightly. So we're talking about 100% funding, like covering the costs entirely. And do you feel that that's a reasonable thing to do, as opposed to sort of expect a landowner to at least contribute a little bit, have a bit of skin in the game, as it were?
I think if you, and Johnny, we discussed this at Highland Show. I let you come in because I think even at the rate we pitched it at, Johnny's first response was, this all looks great, but your rates aren't high enough. So I think there's always going to be a conversation to be had, and some of that Johnnie can explain is about I think it was the labour requirement you were talking about at the time that it was going to take. You didn't think that they pitched it high enough, so it's an open conversation. But I think the principle for us is, yes, there's a benefit to the landowner, the farmer, in terms of all the things we've already covered, is what trees bring to the farming system. But there's a wider societal benefit as well, and I think it's in the government's interest to be using some of the public funding that goes towards agriculture in this space. If we're honest, the way the system is at the moment, there's an awful lot of wastage. In my view, we've got a direct area-based payment system where we've got lots of money being funneled to large landowners on the best grade land, which arguably is not the most effective use of public money. So I think there's money within that system, and I know that there's lots of people who disagree with this, not least the NFU, who don't want any money coming out of that. But I think there's a conversation to be had about how best we use the limited budget, and for my money, this is one of the areas in which we should be investing.
Great, well do come back on that. Now I'm aware we're out of time, so if there are just, from all of you now, is there one thing you want people to take away, or one thing on your wish list, just to kind of really sum up where you've got to in your heads around this kind of conversation? Start with you, Johnnie.
I would love to see agroforestry being valued in money terms by the policymakers, and paying for that value what they think it's worth, rather than looking at how much it costs to put in and then giving that cost or a proportion of that cost. I think the value minus rather than a cost plus would be
A better way to think about these things.
From a land manager's perspective. If they want the benefit that has a value to society of whatever it is, well, okay, fine. Pay the landowner for that, or the crofter, or whoever it is.
Yeah, great.
I completely agree. Communication, it comes back to what I've said throughout it. Getting the right language used, but also the right audience and the right delivery agent, I suppose, to get that message across. I think there will be whole-scale changes for crofting, for the benefit, not replacing the current land management, but enhancing, improving, making it more resilient to climate shocks. I think there's a lot of wins to be had there. I think we just need to reframe the argument a little bit and change our language.
Brilliant, thank you.
I think my message would be that we're at a point of change. The Agriculture Bill has just passed through Parliament. There's opportunities here to try and get it right, and moving forward for agriculture, for forestry, and both intertwined. So, legislation can be a bit dull, but try to keep yourselves informed and, lobby your politicians, or, get involved in the process to make sure that we can get this right.
David, I can see some waving at that. Go on, what do you
sorry
want?
to interrupt. Just in case anybody is interested in the report that David was talking about, we've got a list of our agroforestry reports, and that one's at the top with QR codes so that you can access them. So just grab a leaflet on your way out. So sorry.
Fantastic. Colleen, I should have been saying that. Well done. I think I agree with everything the guys have been saying. I think it's been an interesting discussion. I think for me, it's easy to lose sight when you're in the weeds of thinking about policy that actually progress is being made. And I think there's been a couple of examples here where we're getting to a good place. There's always going to be an element of debate and discussion about whether it's exactly right. I think it's moving in the right direction, which is really positive. And for me, the next big challenge is, we talked about hearts and minds. If we can convince NFU Scotland to start talking a bit more positively about trees, and I'm working on that, I think that would help us and go a long way as well.
Brilliant. Great summing up from you all. Thank you all so much. Thank you for all being here, and well done, guys.